Welcome to episode 10 of the G2 on 5G, the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. But before we get started, you might notice a new branding treatment on our podcast. And in an effort to provide some consistency on look and feel with our other colleagues, Mark Vina that covers Smart Home, and Matt and Steve that cover Data Center, you're going to see this new branding treatment. And we have Anshel to thank for all the post-production on that. So let's get started. My first topic this week is news from the FCC. They have immediately cut off the Universal Service Fund for U.S. rural operators that are maintaining Chinese infrastructure. And as everyone knows, Huawei has been in the crosshairs as well as ZTE. I really think this is too abrupt. I mean, it's effective immediately. And basically, it pulls the rug out from under these rural operators on supporting their current infrastructure. Now, certainly on the deployment of 5G, there's a lot of discussion that's been going around on pivoting away, obviously, from Chinese infrastructure based on security concerns. But I really think this is too abrupt. We need to give these rural operators, sort of a longer runway. Anshel, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of these rural operators are kind of like small to medium businesses, so they're not really in a position to acquire the capital they need to quickly replace equipment. And I think a lot of people would agree that it was kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid. They didn't really give them enough time to really do this, and it's a source of funding that they've relied upon. It's unfortunately, it seems like it's another political move rather than one that really allows the right approach to be taken. I wish it was done quicker, obviously, but I also don't think just doing it this abruptly, immediately, with no recourse is the right approach.
Yeah, the U.S. has given companies that are integrating Chinese components within their supply chain time to pivot away. They've given extensions to companies like Huawei that are integrating U.S. technology, and I think the FCC should have done the same. With respect to this particular issue, but time will tell. So let's shift to your first topic this week. All of your topics involve operator updates, but you've got some things to discuss around T-Mobile as well as Boost.
Yeah, so first operator is going to be T-Mobile. And basically they made a series of announcements this week. Most of them are actually related to 5G, which is why we're covering it. The first one was that they announced that they were able to achieve a 60-mile 5G connection in partnership with Ericsson and OnePlus and Qualcomm. And they were able to basically create and sustain a 5G connection over a distance of 60 miles, obviously using their 600 megahertz spectrum, which is kind of the idea that they could promise that they could deliver that kind of coverage. But they didn't give very many details. I would have liked them to talk about more what kind of speeds they were getting, and could you watch a video at that distance? Could you make a phone call? Like what's actually possible at 60 miles, right?
Yeah.
But I still think that I believe LTE was around 40 miles, so I think getting 60 miles, would in theory allow for much better coverage in rural areas, which is ultimately what I think a lot of people care about, and which is why I think T-Mobile even mentioned this announcement. Because it kind of supports their story around getting, rural coverage going. Now, that said, at the same time, they also deactivated Sprint's 2.5 gigahertz 5G in about 5 or 6 cities, which were the cities that they were able to launch before T-Mobile acquired them. The interesting thing is that T-Mobile's already managed to pull up the majority of those cities with T-Mobile 2.5 gigahertz. And they're actually getting it to run faster, even if they're using the same amount of spectrum. So they're actually getting better bandwidth and better speeds from the same spectrum that Sprint was using. So clearly they're utilizing it much better. But some users that have those devices that were tied to Sprint's network, some of them, the older ones, are not going to work on this new network with T-Mobile. So they're going to have to roll out some programs that they're already rolling out, but they're going to have some programs where people have to upgrade to new devices, and they're doing some kind of schemes there. And then the final piece of news with T-Mobile is that they finally closed their sale of Boost, which was originally a Sprint sub-brand, prepaid, and they spun that off to Dish, I believe, last 24 hours. So
Yep.
lots of big news in the T-Mobile world, lots of 5G updates. And yeah, I think it's a lot of good progress. But we'll see on the Boost side what Dish ends up actually doing, which I think leads into your next topic.
It does, yeah. Great segue, buddy. So it was announced this week that Dish is embracing ORAN. It's no surprise to me because ORAN's going to bring a level of agility when you look at Rakuten and, kind of trendsetters that are using a lot of software defined. It's also going to bring obvious CapEx and OpEx savings. But I found their choice of partners a little puzzling, including Fujitsu. There's certainly a lot of other infrastructure providers, both hardware as well as pure play software like Mavenir, that have a demonstrated track record. So Fujitsu was sort of puzzling to me. It makes me wonder, is Fujitsu putting some subsidies on the line, to entice them to bust into the US? I mean, do you have any thoughts there?
I think the Fujitsu partnership might be something that Dish was inspired by from Rakuten.
Yeah.
I believe Rakuten's mostly using NEC though, but I think they're also using Fujitsu, and I think that might be the source of this, partnership.
Right.
But it's hard to tell.
Right.
But that's the first thought that comes to mind, is that this might be related to the way Rakuten's building out their network.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things go. But Rakuten has certainly been a maverick and a pioneer with respect to virtualization and software defined. So time will tell. Let's shift to your second topic, and we're going to talk about SK Telecom, right, in South Korea.
Yeah, so actually, we're going to talk about all three carriers.
Oh, okay.
In Korea, they were the first country to actually launch 5G, and I believe they beat Verizon by like a day. And SKT was the first to launch. And what basically happened is all three carriers have reported what their numbers are for 5G subscribers, and they're just shy of 7 million subscribers, which is pretty good for a smaller country like Korea. And I think that it shows that there's a significant amount of growth for 5G users already. And when there's an infrastructure for it and the devices, there is uptake. And there's not it's not a weak uptake either. SK Telecom has 3.1 million subscribers. KT has 2.08, and LGU Plus has 1.68, which all kind of align with the size of their user bases. So, I think it's pretty promising, and it looks good for the growth of 5G. And, even though there's COVID, people are still upgrading their phones and upgrading to the newest network because it's faster and they're better devices. So I think it's more proof in the pudding that people are still upgrading to 5G regardless of the situation.
Yeah, I agree. And, SK Telecom has been a leader, driving use case around 5G. I mean, what do you attribute this growth to? Is it purely access? Is it use case? Is it a combination of both?
Well, I think use case is the least strong. I think we're still not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But I would say they have coverage and they've got speeds. And when you combine speeds and coverage, it's kind of a no-brainer, especially if you don't charge extra for it.
Right.
So I think that's something to consider, is if they're not charging much of a premium or they're not charging any premium, and it's an option to get 5G or not get 5G, you're going to get 5G.
Yeah, good point. Let's shift to my third topic and final topic for the week. And it's news coming from the European Commission, not the European Union, but the European Commission is the regulatory kind of harmonization, body for all of Europe. And this week they set some small cell rule adoption, and it was an attempt to not necessarily deregulate, but not require operators to go through the traditional planning and filing process for small cells by defining, what a small cell was and how it would be installed and that sort of thing. I think this is critical. I mean, Europe has, in a lot of places, been a laggard relative to the rest of the world because each country has different policies regarding deployment and spectrum management and that sort of thing. And so I think this really sort of opens things up, and it's going to be really critical with millimeter wave because, as you know and I know, you need that densification to really provide a strong millimeter wave platform. So, any thoughts from your perspective there?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. The Europeans are famous for their regulations,
Yeah.
but I think that sometimes it's good that they have a unified regulatory environment, and that they're able to, create a blanket regulatory environment for deploying small cells. So
Yeah.
there's no confusion about what can and can't be done, what should and shouldn't be done. Makes the lives of the operators easier, infrastructure vendors. This might actually help them catch up
Mm-hmm.
to Europe, to the US and Asia,
Yeah.
because, we're still struggling with that in the US, even though we've got the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously China, they control everything. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see how having the permits in place and the regulatory infrastructure correctly set up may
Yeah.
help them accelerate their deployments.
Yeah, I agree. And keep your eyes on Airspan Networks. So they are big into small cells. They were, if you remember WiMAX, they were in the WiMAX space.
I
They
remember.
pivoted very aggressively, and they, for example, they've been building the Sprint, Magic Box, the
Hmm.
small cell product. So, and they offer a lot of different solutions. So I think they're a company to keep an eye on as the small cells start proliferating. So let's shift to your third and final topic, and you want to talk about AT&T.
Yeah, so AT&T this week announced that they're deploying 5G in 28 more cities.
Mm-hmm.
And the big deal is that they're now deploying DSS,
Yeah.
which means that they're sharing 4G they're using the same spectrum to share 4G and 5G service,
Yeah.
which enables them to get better coverage over 5G because they were also a millimeter wave first operator,
Mm-hmm.
but they're now deploying lots of sub 6 gigahertz spectrum, and they're now using DSS to enable themselves to do more in more places. So by adding these 28 cities, they are now going to be in a total of 335 markets across the country, covering
Mm-hmm.
160 million total pops, which means potential, customers. But the interesting thing is that they didn't say which markets are DSS markets and which ones are using dedicated spectrum,
Right.
and they also didn't say what kind of speeds you can expect from a DSS deployment, because you are sharing the spectrum, and that means that 4G users could impact 5G users' speeds and
Right.
vice versa.
Yeah.
But we don't know what that situation is today. I believe they're actually deploying DSS before Verizon, even though Verizon has announced their plans,
Mm-hmm.
but they just haven't rolled it out yet.
Yeah.
So yeah, AT&T is kind of on the leading edge with that, and we'll see how that works out long term. Realistically, I think that DSS will be much less important long term, but short term it's super important because it gives you
Yeah.
that 5G coverage in places where
Right.
you simply don't have it.
Exactly. As we move to a standalone deployment. Hey, for those listeners and watchers that might not be familiar with DSS, it's dynamic spectrum sharing. Do you want to take a second and define exactly what that is?
Yeah, so basically what it does is it's a unique technology to certain infrastructure vendors like Ericsson, and they basically are taking a certain block of spectrum that was originally dedicated to 4G and
Mm-hmm.
actually has an existing 4G signal, and then they add 5G to it, and they basically are sending 5G signal and 4G signal simultaneously, and
Mm-hmm.
depending on the type of device you have, you grab the appropriate G,
Right.
and users of 4G and 5G can coexist on the same band of spectrum and
Mm-hmm.
are basically sharing that same spectrum, which includes sharing the bandwidth.
Yeah.
So when you have 4G and 5G users sharing the same bandwidth, they can affect one another. But
Yeah.
realistically, a lot of the 5G users are former 4G users, so it shouldn't really affect speeds much. In fact, 5G users should theoretically get slightly faster speeds
Mm-hmm.
because they're utilizing the spectrum more efficiently. But that's a much more difficult, more nuanced conversation that we still have yet to figure out.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, hey, bud, another great podcast this week. Why don't you take us home?
Sure. We hope that our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us with any interesting or specific topics on 5G that they would like us to cover in a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, And I'm at Anshel on Twitter. And we hope that you guys have a great 4th of July weekend. And please tune again next week.